You mentioned that there is a lot of intercontinental migration that is going on, some of it apparently quite successful. So why is it that the migrants from West Africa are fleeing to Europe?
Many of those migrants who leave the continent leave because, in their view, the opportunities are broader in countries outside of the continent. Bear in mind that the continent is still developing, and in many cases, our continent is young, so creating the jobs for all the young people on the continent becomes a real challenge, and some of them seek opportunities elsewhere. But the record is clear. Within the continent, as I mentioned, 70% of the overall migration is intra-Africa, moving from one African country to another. And bear in mind, that is the small number, relatively speaking, that actually cross over. But because they face such hardships, because many times their rights are infringed upon, these get the sensational reports. And then it forms this perception that the majority of Africans are trying to leave the continent to seek opportunities. But the reality is really far from the perception.
How do you see today, or how do you evaluate today the behavior of European governments related to immigration? So this is the first question. Secondly, when you talk about this flux, the internal flux, do you have numbers for that? Is that, you mentioned 70%, but 70% of what?
I believe that by and large, the European countries have been quite supportive of immigration. More recently, with what has happened in North Africa and that crossover, and the results of that have become so sensational that the perception was developed that there's a migrant crisis, and that this crisis, and in those cases, responses begin to shift and to change. Now, the 70% is on the basis of data, statistics that have been gathered by the Economic Commission Africa as to that 70% is of the total migration. The quality of data is still being refined, that the numbers are still being gathered. The panel and those entities and institutions working with the high-level panel, working on the global contact for migration, will find that these numbers will become firmer, where when the reports come out, we'll be able to have those numbers that we can speak about with a certain amount of certainty.
What we're seeing nowadays is that right-wing parties are basically using this crisis to gain support, to put fear on the population, and basically it's a struggle for power, using basically migration as an issue. Do you see this as a threat to your work, to the fact that you're trying to deal with this in a positive way?
Yes, it's a threat to the work of the panel and the objectives of the panel. It's a threat to the Global Compact and what it seeks to do in terms of changing the narrative on migration. And it's a threat to the good things that are happening in migration, because there are good, positive things that are happening. How can we respond to this threat? I think is the issue. And we hope that the work of the panel identifying the challenges in terms of the negative narrative that exists, but then also the reality in terms of the positive contribution made by migrants to Africa's development and by extension to global development. I hope we can convey those kinds of messages very clearly so that we can begin to get to the consciousness of those who have this wrong perception and see if we can turn it around.
I was wondering if in your data for intra-African movement, if there are any patterns that you say detected in terms of people moving from Central Africa to Southern Africa and Central Africa to East Africa. You know, do you have any patterns that you measure in the data that you have?
Much of the intra-Africa migration is the transfer of skills. And sometimes that is not well known. Those that have a surplus in technical know-how, in expertise, are usually invited to come into Africa to be able to help those countries that have insufficient capacity to deal with their development issues. But let me say one thing too, because this came out very clearly from the Executive Director of the Economic Commission for Africa, that while this intra-migration in Africa is very welcome, she was clear to point out that there are some tensions there, because we have to recognize that this is not always 100% welcome, you know, by country residents themselves, because it may be perceived as taking opportunities from citizens, from residents and whatnot. So there's that tension that also has to be dealt with, but that the transfer of skills and sometimes for opportunities. Where do they go? They identify countries where the opportunities are better. So you see many countries going to South Africa, many countries going to Kenya, going to Ghana today, Senegal, all those places that are perceived to be prosperous country where the opportunities are ample. We hope that again, we can begin to understand all of this, get better data on it, and then be able to make the kind of recommendation to improve the knowledge of everyone regarding migration, because we do believe that there are more positive effects from migration that seem not to be known.
How, in your work, do you see the challenge of making migration, especially the intercontinental migration, safer and regular in a situation where you're dealing with 54 different countries? How challenging is that in trying to get a kind of a uniform regime across the 54 countries to facilitate this and also to negotiate with the Europeans in order to create something that will help the safe movement of people?
I think it's the first step of the Global Compact when adopted, and the panel report when concluded will attempt to bring to the attention of African governments the need for their own internal policies, for their political will, to be able to give citizens an identity, to be able to come up with those measures about protecting people. And because it's going to be international, the protocols that will be signed by all the parties in both cases, within Africa itself through its own African Union protocols, and then globally through the compact, one's hoping that you can find the orderly means for transfer, that there will be more consciousness on the protection of human rights, that there will be the safeguards for migrants looking for opportunities where they'll be able to go in, even if the opportunities do not materialize, that at least they are protected and find some means whereby until such time either they return to their countries again in an orderly fashion, in a legal fashion, in a safe fashion, than what currently persists, in where crossing over they are mistreated. There are times when their country of origin is totally unaware of where they are, and to be able to help them. And so that's what's being sought right now. Safe, orderly, regular means for them to go, for the partner states within this global compact to accord them certain basic human rights, to allow them access to legal assistance if necessary, and opportunities if possible. That's what we seek to achieve. And the media could help us too. If sensationalism doesn't help.
How do you make the countries acknowledge that there are certain push factors in their own countries and that they can actually help or facilitate this movement?
I think that's what the Global Compact tries to call for. You know, that there are going to be responsibility and obligations on both sides. And we expect that they'll be able to have a means whereby the registration of migrants have an orderly fashion, both in the countries of origin and the passage countries, the transit countries, as well as the host countries, so that the exchange of information will be there. Bear in mind also that in Africa, we too have to have those important mitigants to be able to reduce migration, no matter how small it already is. And that's a growing economy that creates jobs, that attracts private capital. Our own laws relating to human rights and the protection of our own citizens. Those are the things that give the confidence, you know, of citizens and helps to minimize the chances that they will want to seek opportunities abroad. And if I may mention another thing, remittances. You know, remittances today form a major support for African economies. And those remittances are coming from many of them may have been migrants originally, who have obtained opportunities, who have been able to secure resources that they repatriate. And one of the things we hope we're going to bring to the consciousness is that the cost of those remittances to African countries is far higher than remittances within Europe or in other places, and that's not fair. Either to those migrants that have worked hard to get those resources to send back to their country, nor is it fair to the receiving country. So I hope that that point will also be brought up and some effort will be made. It's already been discussed in so many ways and always reported on. So these are things that are already known, but if we can just bring them to a little more focus, with a little more recommendations that are specific, maybe we can make some progress in addressing it.
This is your third panel meeting. How many more do you anticipate? Will you need to collect more data before you're ready to come out with your recommendations, or do you actually can give us a sort of preview of the sort of recommendations that you expect will come forth from your deliberations?
All right, I will speak with tongue in cheek because we're not supposed to say what our report will be until our heads of states have endorsed it. But I imagine we'll call for all African states to ratify all the protocols, to endorse them, to have them a part of their own national agendas. And you know, that's a normal call. I think we'll call for national actions on the things that's being recommended. And so basically, that would be it, that African countries will have to take the first step. The protocols, their own national agendas, their own national policies, you know, their own laws and whatnot that need to be revised or need to be formulated to be able to enable them to meet the commitment that we will sign, either with the free movement of people. And also, you know, we have many instruments that already exist. So implementation of some of those that they've already agreed to through protocols will also be important.
If I may veer a little bit off script, You were president during the terrible Ebola epidemic in West Africa, and there is an outbreak now in the DR Congo. How do you view the current situation from the experience that you had, which was pretty rocky when the epidemic was going on, and to how things may have changed or improved for the better, or what is happening now in the DR Congo? Whether you believe that, in fact, lessons have been learned, the situation may be contained faster than it happened in your own country.
I think our health care delivery systems, including infection control, has been quite improved since the experience with Ebola. And so the capacity to be able to address any outbreak is now improved in the affected countries as well as in other places. I think there's an important new dimension in the fight for Ebola, and that is vaccine. We use the other countries that are affected to be able to test vaccines, and right now in TRC, I think they're doing that right now. They're giving vaccination to the different people to see that it works, and we believe that some of the trials have shown that they do work. And so we're hoping that DRC, like others, will have a capacity to deal with it, to stop the spread. And I also believe that their own, the experience of our experience, it was an interesting thing that while the affected countries in West Africa was experiencing Ebola, there were volunteers from other African countries, including DRC. And so those volunteers also drew from our experience, and they go back home a bit more capable also to work with their local authorities to be able to address this. So we're hoping that DRC will come out of this, without the major effect, the major results that we saw in the 3 countries that were not prepared.